our work with just finding angles, okay? Here are two uh, two additional types of angles. We've already talked about right angles and straight angles, but I wanted to also introduce you adjacent angles. Now, the word adjacent, just in regular English language, means next to. So when we're talking about an adjacent angle, we're talking about two angles that are right next to each other, okay? And geometrically, that means they share a common side. And in this, or if you remember when we define angles, they share a ray, okay? So, and a vertex, okay? So that this shared ray and the shared vertex is what makes these two angles adjacent and next to each other. So here we have angle ABD. That's how we would name it. Or we could name it DBA. Order technically doesn't matter. And angle ABD is adjacent to angle DBC. Okay. Now, vertical angles, and I mentioned that in as one of the examples at the very beginning of the slideshow. Adjacent angles share a vertex, but are opposite one another. Just like, and what makes vertical angles unique is that they are equal in value. So you'll notice here that these two angles, they share a vertex and they're opposite to one another. So it's kind of like, think of it as the opposite sides of an X. So the two angles that are measured at 75 degrees, these two angles are vertical, and consequently the larger obtuse angles at 105 degrees are also vertical angles. Two other terms about angles. Now, we've already talked about right angles and straight angles, and the fact that a right angle is 90 degrees and a straight angle is 180 degrees. Well, not two angles that actually come together or are adjacent to form and add up to 90 degrees are angles we call complementary. Okay, so any two angles that when we add them together equal 90, we can call them complementary. Now, here I have two examples. Here we have 30 and 60, and these angles are adjacent because they're right next to each other. They share a vertex. These are complementary angles. But you'll notice that these two angles here, 63 and 27, they also add to 90 degrees. So these two angles are also complementary. And that is because the criteria for being complementary is just that they add to 90. So they don't have to be adjacent as they are in this particular example. These two angles, although we would call them non-adjacent or non-touching, they add to 90, so they too are complementary. And similarly, I can have two angles that are adjacent or non-adjacent, but what makes them supplementary is that they add to 180 degrees. So here I have 120 plus 60, that gives me 180. And again, this particular example shows that those angles are adjacent, but they don't have to be. The criteria is just that they add to 180 degrees. And sometimes you'll also hear them referred to as a linear pair. And if you notice that the first four letters of linear is line. Okay, so anytime you have a line, we know that that is equal to 180 degrees. So every line created by two angles are also supplementary. Now, how can you remember the difference? I know several students sometimes have a hard time and confuse the difference between complementary and supplementary. So I did a little example here. You notice how the blue, my blue ink, I have the letter C, and that is obviously the first letter of complementary. Well, if I close that C with a line, you'll notice it forms the number 9. So complementary angles are equal to 90 degrees. And here in my blue ink, I have the S for the first letter of supplementary. Well, if I close that S like I did with my red pen, I get the letter 8. And so that means that supplementary is 180 degrees. So that's just a fun way to think about, if you get confused, how you can remember the difference between complementary and supplementary.